Imagine standing at the edge of freedom, knowing that one step forward means life and one step back means death. Now imagine making that journey not once, but 19 times. Not for yourself, but for others. Returning again and again into the land of bondage, risking capture, torture, and execution to lead people you loved to freedom. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is the true story of Harriet Tubman, a woman who was born into slavery, escaped to freedom, and then became the most successful conductor on the Underground Railroad. A woman so fearless that slaveholders put a $40,000 bounty on her head. A woman who never lost a single passenger on her journeys to freedom. They called her Moses. And this is her story. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe and drop a like. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from you. Now, let's dive into the incredible life of Harriet Tubman. The year is 1822, and in Dorchester County, Maryland, a baby girl is born into slavery. Her parents name her Araminta Ross, though everyone calls her Minty. She's born on a plantation owned by Edward Brodess, and from the moment she takes her first breath, she belongs to him. Not as a daughter, not as a person, as property. Minty's mother, Harriet Green, was known as Old Rit. Her father, Ben Ross, was a timber inspector. They were both enslaved, which meant their children were born enslaved. 9 children in total, though some would be sold away before Minty was old enough to remember their faces. This was the horror of slavery. Families torn apart like they meant nothing. Children sold like livestock. Mothers screaming as their babies were carried away, never to be seen again. Minty grew up watching this, learning that love was dangerous because anything you loved could be taken from you, learning that family was temporary, learning that her life had no value to the people who owned her. When Minty was only 5 or 6 years old, she was rented out to a woman who needed someone to watch her baby. Just a child herself, Minty was expected to stay awake all night, rocking the cradle, making sure the infant didn't cry. If the baby cried, the woman would whip Minty, a child whipping a child for failing to control an infant. Minty still bears the scars on her neck from those whippings, physical marks that would remain for her entire life. She was also forced to check muskrat traps in the freezing marshes, wading through icy water, even when she was sick with measles. She became so ill that she was sent back to her mother, worthless to her renter. Too sick to work meant too sick to be profitable. But Minty survived. She always survived. As she grew older, she was put to work in the fields. Hard, brutal labor under the burning sun. But she preferred it to domestic work. In the fields, she was away from the constant surveillance of the house. In the fields, she could be strong, and Minty was strong. Stronger than many men, they said. She could lift heavy timber, plow fields, drive oxen. She became known for her physical power. But it was what happened when she was about 13 years old that would change her life forever. One day, Minty was in a store when an enslaved man tried to run away. The overseer demanded that Minty help restrain him. She refused. The man ran for the door, and Minty blocked the overseer's path, giving the enslaved man time to escape. The overseer picked up a 2-pound weight and threw it. He was aiming for the running man, but it struck Minty in the head instead. The impact fractured her skull. She collapsed, bleeding, nearly dead. She was carried back to her mother's cabin, where she lay unconscious for days. No doctor was called. Enslaved people didn't get doctors. She was expected to either recover or die, and if she died, well, that was just a financial loss. But Minty didn't die. She woke up. But she was changed. For the rest of her life, she would suffer from seizures. She would fall into sudden, deep sleeps, sometimes in the middle of conversations, sometimes in the middle of work. She would experience vivid visions, dreams that felt more real than waking life. She believed these visions were messages from God, glimpses of the future, warnings and guidance. Some people thought she was simple-minded because of the injury. They saw her fall asleep suddenly and thought she was weak, damaged. They had no idea that behind those sleeping eyes, a revolutionary was being born, because Minty began to see her seizures not as a disability, but as a gift, a way to communicate with the divine, a source of strength that her enslavers couldn't understand or control. And during those visions, she began to see something else, a path, a way out, a future where she was free. Around this time, Minty heard about a woman on a nearby plantation who was about to be sold to the Deep South. This was a death sentence in many ways. The Deep South meant harsher conditions, crueler masters, cotton plantations where people were worked to death. It meant being separated from family forever, with no hope of escape or reunion. The woman prayed. She prayed so hard that her prayers seemed to shake the heavens. She prayed that her master would die before he could sell her. And he did. He died suddenly, unexpectedly. Minty heard this story and understood something profound. Prayer wasn't passive. Faith wasn't about accepting suffering. Faith was about demanding justice, even when justice seemed impossible. Faith was a weapon. This realization planted a seed in Minty's heart, a seed that would grow into an unshakable conviction that God intended her to be free, and that she had the right to claim that freedom, no matter what the laws of men said. In 1844, when she was about 22 years old, Minty married a free black man named John Tubman. She changed her name to Harriet, taking her mother's name. Harriet Tubman. A new name, a new identity, a step toward becoming the person she was meant to be. But marriage to John didn't bring the happiness she hoped for. John was free, but Harriet was still enslaved, and under the law, any children they had would be enslaved too, because a child's status followed the mother's. Harriet couldn't bear the thought of bringing children into slavery. She couldn't bear the thought of watching her babies be sold away. And John didn't understand her dreams of freedom. When she talked about escaping, he dismissed her, laughed at her, told her she was foolish, threatened to tell her master if she tried to run. The person she loved most didn't believe in her, didn't support her, didn't see what she saw. So Harriet made a decision. She would have to do this alone. In 1849, Harriet learned that she and her brothers were going to be sold. Edward Brodess had died, and his widow needed money. That meant enslaved people would be auctioned off. It meant the family would be torn apart. It meant Harriet would likely be sold to the Deep South, never to return. This was the moment. Now or never. Freedom or death. Harriet and two of her brothers decided to escape. They slipped away at night, heading north, using the North Star as their guide. But her brothers became frightened. The danger was too great. The punishment for being caught was too severe. They turned back, and they forced Harriet to return with them. But Harriet couldn't give up. She had tasted the possibility of freedom, even if just for a few hours in the darkness. She had felt what it was like to move toward liberation. She couldn't go back to accepting bondage. So a few days later, she tried again. This time, alone. She left at night, without telling anyone, not even her husband. She knew that if she told John, he might betray her. She couldn't say goodbye to her family, couldn't risk anyone knowing her plans. She just disappeared into the darkness, following a route she had heard whispered about in secret. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't an actual railroad. It was a network of secret routes and safe houses used by enslaved people to escape to free states and Canada. It was run by abolitionists, both black and white, who risked their lives to help freedom seekers. The conductors were the guides who led people along the routes. The stations were the safe houses where people could hide and rest. The passengers were the people escaping slavery. Harriet had heard about this network in whispers and coded songs. She had heard that there were people who would help. She had heard about a white woman nearby who was known to assist runaways. So she went to that woman's house and knocked on the door. And that woman gave her directions to the next safe house and the name of someone who could help. And so began Harriet's journey to freedom. She traveled at night, guided by the North Star. She hid during the day, sometimes in barns, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in the woods. She waded through rivers to throw off dogs that might be tracking her scent. She moved in silence, hyper-alert to every sound, every movement, knowing that capture meant torture, sale, or death. She traveled nearly 90 miles from Maryland to Pennsylvania, 90 miles on foot, alone, with nothing but her courage and her faith. And when she finally crossed the border into Pennsylvania, when she finally stood on free soil, she experienced something she had never felt before. She was free. She would later describe that moment as feeling like she was in heaven. The sun was shining on her like it had never shone before. She felt like she was in a new world. But the joy was incomplete, because everyone she loved was still in bondage. Her family was still enslaved. Her people were still suffering. She was free, but she was alone. And Harriet Tubman made a vow in that moment, a vow that would define the rest of her life. She would go back. She would return to the land of slavery, and she would bring her people out. Harriet settled in Philadelphia and found work as a domestic servant and cook. She saved every penny she could, because she was planning something that most people would consider insane. She was going back to Maryland, back into slave territory, to rescue her family. In 1850, she made her first return trip. Her niece, Keziah, and Keziah's 2 children were about to be sold at auction in Cambridge, Maryland. Harriet coordinated with Keziah's free husband, and together they orchestrated a daring rescue. They smuggled the family out before the auction could be completed, and Harriet guided them to freedom in Philadelphia. Her first rescue mission was a success, and she realized something powerful. She could do this. She could go back into danger and bring people out. She had the skills, the courage, and the faith. But that same year, something happened that made her work even more dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This law required that escaped slaves be returned to their masters, even if they had reached free states. It allowed slave catchers to pursue freedom seekers across state lines. It imposed harsh penalties on anyone who helped enslaved people escape. It essentially meant that nowhere in the United States was truly safe for people who had escaped slavery. For Harriet, this meant she had to start taking people all the way to Canada. Philadelphia wasn't far enough anymore. The North wasn't safe enough. Only Canada, where slavery was illegal and the Fugitive Slave Act had no power, could offer true safety. This meant longer journeys, more danger, more distance to cover. But Harriet didn't hesitate. In 1851, she returned to Maryland to rescue one of her brothers and 2 other men. The journey was treacherous, but she brought them safely to Canada. Then she went back again, and again, and again. Over the next decade, Harriet Tubman would make an estimated 13 trips back into slave territory. She would personally lead approximately 70 people to freedom, and she gave instructions and guidance to dozens more who escaped on their own. 13 trips, 70 people, and she never lost a single passenger. Think about that. In an era where recapture meant torture and death, where slave catchers patrolled with dogs and guns, where the law itself was designed to stop her, Harriet Tubman had a perfect record, 100% success rate. How did she do it? First, she was meticulous in her planning. She studied routes, identified safe houses, memorized the locations of rivers and swamps. She knew the land better than most people who lived there. Second, she traveled in winter when the nights were long, giving her more darkness to cover her movements. She usually left on Saturday nights because runaway notices couldn't be printed until Monday, giving her a head start. Third, she was a master of disguise. She would dress as a man or as an old woman. Once, she walked right past her former master while carrying live chickens, and he didn't recognize her because she was disguised and hunched over. Fourth, she used coded songs and signals. Songs like "Wade in the Water" weren't just spirituals, they were instructions. Wade in the water meant throw the dogs off your scent. Follow the drinking gourd meant follow the Big Dipper north. Fifth, she carried a gun, not to shoot slave catchers, but to maintain discipline among her passengers. If someone wanted to turn back, wanted to quit, Harriet would point the gun at them and say, "You'll be free or die." Because if someone turned back, they could be captured and tortured into revealing the routes and safe houses, endangering everyone else. She wasn't cruel. She was realistic. The stakes were too high for weakness. Freedom required absolute commitment. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly, Harriet had an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. She would have feelings, hunches, visions during her seizures that warned her away from certain routes or told her to hide at certain times. More than once, these intuitions saved her and her passengers from capture. People called it divine guidance. Maybe it was. Maybe her connection to God gave her insights that rational analysis couldn't provide. Or maybe her seizures heightened her senses in ways we don't fully understand. Whatever the source, her instincts were almost always right. Slaveholders were terrified of her. They knew someone was orchestrating these escapes, someone who seemed impossible to catch. They put up wanted posters. They offered rewards. The bounty on Harriet Tubman's head eventually reached $40,000. That's the equivalent of over $1 million today. $40,000 for a woman who was barely 5 feet tall, who couldn't read or write, who had a debilitating neurological condition. They were that desperate to stop her, but they never caught her. She moved like a ghost through the night, always one step ahead, always protected by a combination of skill, courage, and faith. One of her most famous rescues was in 1857, when she went back for her parents. Ben and old Rit were elderly by this time, and Ben had been accused of helping enslaved people escape. He was in danger of being arrested. Harriet knew she had to get them out, but her parents were too old to make the long journey on foot. So Harriet did something audacious. She built a makeshift carriage, a crude wagon, and actually transported her elderly parents in it, traveling by back roads and through woods, somehow evading capture while moving a slow, conspicuous vehicle through slave territory. She got them safely to Canada. Her parents, who had endured decades of slavery, who had watched their children be sold away, who had suffered unimaginable pain, finally experienced freedom in their old age because their daughter refused to leave them behind. Harriet wanted to rescue her husband John, too. She went back to Maryland to find him, hoping he would come with her to freedom. But when she arrived, she discovered that John had remarried. He had taken another wife and had no interest in escaping or in seeing Harriet again. The rejection must have been crushing. But Harriet didn't let it stop her. She took other people who wanted freedom and led them north. She couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, but she wouldn't waste the opportunity to help those who did. By the late 1850s, Harriet Tubman had become a legend in both black and white abolitionist communities. She met with Frederick Douglass, who called her a woman of incredible courage and determination. She met with John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed armed insurrection was necessary to end slavery. Brown called her General Tubman and consulted with her as he planned his raid on Harper's Ferry. Brown's raid failed, and he was executed for treason. But his actions, and the growing tensions over slavery, pushed the nation closer to civil war. And when war finally came in 1861, Harriet Tubman saw it as the culmination of everything she had been fighting for. This was the war that would end slavery. This was God's judgment on a nation that had tolerated bondage for so long. And Harriet Tubman intended to be part of it. When the Civil War began, Harriet went to South Carolina to work with the Union Army. She served as a nurse at first, caring for sick and wounded soldiers, both black and white. She used her knowledge of herbal medicine, learned from her mother, to treat various ailments. But the Union Army quickly realized that Harriet had skills far more valuable than nursing. She knew the land. She knew how to move undetected. She had connections with enslaved people throughout the South who could provide intelligence. She was perfect for covert operations. So Harriet Tubman became a spy and a scout for the Union Army. She worked with Colonel James Montgomery, organizing intelligence networks among enslaved people who were fleeing to Union lines. These freedom seekers provided crucial information about Confederate troop movements, supply routes, and fortifications. Harriet also began leading scouting missions into Confederate territory. She would travel up rivers in the dark, mapping out plantations, identifying where enslaved people were held, and planning liberation operations. And then came June 2nd, 1863, the Combahee River Raid, one of the most extraordinary military operations of the Civil War, and the only military engagement in American history planned and executed by a woman. Harriet Tubman, along with Colonel Montgomery and about 150 black Union soldiers, embarked on a mission up the Combahee River in South Carolina. Their goals were to destroy Confederate supply lines, disrupt plantations, and liberate enslaved people. The raid was conducted at night. 3 Union gunboats moved silently up the river, guided by Harriet's intelligence about the locations of Confederate mines and torpedoes. She had gathered this information from her network of scouts and spies. As the boats moved upriver, they began shelling plantations and destroying infrastructure. Warehouses full of cotton and rice went up in flames. Confederate soldiers fled in panic. But the most important part of the mission was liberating the enslaved people. And this is where Harriet's presence became crucial. When the Union boats arrived at the plantations, hundreds of enslaved people saw their chance for freedom. They ran toward the river, carrying children, grabbing what few possessions they could. But many were hesitant, afraid this might be a trap, unsure whether to trust the Union soldiers. Then they saw Harriet, a black woman, standing on the deck of a Union gunboat, calling to them, singing to them, urging them to come, to run, to claim their freedom. And they came, men, women, children, the elderly. They poured toward the boats. Over 700 people liberated in a single night, the largest liberation of enslaved people in American history until the Emancipation Proclamation took full effect. It was chaos. People were scrambling onto the boats, desperate not to be left behind. Harriet had to maintain order, had to make sure people got on safely, had to prevent the boats from being overloaded and capsizing. She later described seeing women carrying babies in one arm and pigs in the other, determined not to leave behind anything of value. She saw children being passed hand to hand onto the boats. She saw families reunited with loved ones they thought they'd lost. And through it all, Confederate soldiers were firing from the shore, trying to stop the raid, trying to prevent the enslaved people from escaping. But the Union gunboats returned fire, covering the evacuation. By dawn, the mission was complete. Over 700 people freed, Confederate infrastructure destroyed, and not a single Union casualty. Harriet Tubman had just pulled off one of the most successful military raids of the Civil War. But here's the most outrageous part of this story. Despite her incredible service, Despite being a spy, scout, and military strategist, despite risking her life repeatedly for the Union cause, Harriet Tubman was never paid a proper military salary. She received only $200 total for 3 years of service. $200. Male soldiers were paid $13 a month. Harriet got $200 for 3 years. She had to support herself by selling pies and root beer to soldiers. A woman who conducted military operations, who liberated 700 people in one night, had to sell food to survive because the government wouldn't pay her. It wasn't until 1899, 36 years after the war ended, that she was finally granted a modest pension. And even then, it wasn't for her own service. It was a widow's pension for being married to a Civil War veteran in her second marriage. The government refused to acknowledge her own military contributions. This is the reality of being a black woman in America, even when you're a hero. Your contributions are minimized. Your labor is undervalued. Your sacrifices are ignored. But Harriet didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it was right, because freedom was worth fighting for, because her people needed her. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, Harriet settled in Auburn, New York. She had purchased a small piece of land there before the war, and she made it her home. But Harriet couldn't stop helping people. It wasn't in her nature to rest while others suffered. She turned her property into a haven for elderly and indigent black people who had nowhere else to go. She cared for them, fed them, provided them with shelter and dignity. She also became active in the women's suffrage movement, because freedom wasn't complete if women couldn't vote. Freedom wasn't complete if women couldn't have equal rights. Harriet spoke at suffrage conventions alongside women like Susan B. Anthony and Emily Howland. She told her story over and over at churches and meeting halls so that people would remember, so that people would understand the cost of freedom, so that people would never forget what slavery had been. She never learned to read or write, but she dictated her experiences to Sarah Bradford, who published a biography. The book helped Harriet raise money to support her charitable work and to survive in her old age. In 1896, Harriet purchased land adjacent to her property and established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. It was a dream she'd had for years to create a proper facility for elderly black people who had no family to care for them. She worked on this project until the very end of her life, raising funds, organizing, ensuring that the home would continue after she was gone. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died. She was approximately 91 years old, though her exact age was uncertain because enslaved people's birth records were rarely kept. She died surrounded by friends and family in the home for the aged that she had founded. Her last words were reported to be a message of faith and determination. "I go to prepare a place for you." Even in death, she was still leading people toward freedom, still showing the way, still being Moses. Harriet Tubman's life is almost impossible to comprehend. She was born into one of the most brutal systems of oppression in human history. She was denied education, denied basic human rights, denied control over her own body and future. But she refused to accept that this was her fate. She escaped. And then, when she could have simply enjoyed her freedom, when she could have built a quiet life far from danger, she went back. 19 times, risking everything, for other people. She led 70 people to freedom with her own hands. She provided guidance and support to dozens more. She liberated over 700 people in a single military operation. She served as a spy, a scout, a nurse, a military strategist. She fought for women's rights. She cared for the poor and elderly. And she did all of this while suffering from debilitating seizures caused by a traumatic brain injury, while being hunted by slave catchers with a $40,000 bounty on her head, while being denied fair compensation for her work. while living in a society that viewed her as inferior because of her race and her gender. Harriet Tubman didn't have wealth. She didn't have formal education. She didn't have institutional power. What she had was courage. She had faith. She had an unbreakable commitment to justice. And that was enough to change history. Today, Harriet Tubman is recognized as one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. There are monuments to her, museums dedicated to her, schools named after her. She's being placed on the $20 bill, her face replacing Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder and the architect of Native American genocide. But more important than monuments and currency is what Harriet Tubman represents. She represents the idea that one person, armed with courage and conviction, can make a profound difference. She represents the idea that the most marginalized people in society can be the most heroic. She represents the idea that freedom is not given, it is taken, it is fought for. It is earned through sacrifice and blood and unwavering determination. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, a piece of property with no rights and no future. She died Harriet Tubman, an American legend, a military hero, and a symbol of liberation. She was Moses, and she led her people out of bondage. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are so many more untold stories from Black history, and we're going to tell them all. Until next time, remember, freedom is worth fighting for, and sometimes one person can change the world. This is Untold Black History.